Hi, Dr. Dave Webster. Again, on my video blog series, The Travesty of Patient Access to PET-CT in our Ontario Liberals' so-called evidence-based patients first healthcare system. And of course, I'm sure what you're asking yourself, is it really patients first or patients last? This particular video, we're exploring case examples to help you decide whether Dr. Eric Hoskins is our Minister of Health or our Minister of Disease. This will now hopefully enlighten patients with colon cancer in Ontario who are in his sights and when he wants to apply this agenda to you personally. So this is an example of a 56-year-old patient diagnosed with colon cancer back in 2016 and has been treated, and based on the compulsory CCO standards of care and investigation has been told they're disease-free. That involves CT exams, maybe an MR, colonoscopy maybe, and so on, and a blood test called the carcinoembryonic antigen, or CEA blood test. So let's just look at that blood test, CEA blood test, because we're going to hear more about this as part of cancer patients. But it turns out that all normal anti-cancer cells have things called antigens on their cell membranes, and these are typically proteins, and they have different molecules attached to them, and again found on the outer surface of the cell membranes. And in fact, these proteins and substances can end up in the patient's blood, which we may then be able to measure. So here's an example of a model or a little cartoon of a cell here, the nucleus here, and these little black arrows are pointing to these different colored and different shaped things on the cell membrane, flapping the breeze here of the fluids surrounding the cell here. Let's take a little closer look, and you can see the proteins here, the cell membrane, but look at how different the shapes of these various molecules are. And that becomes very important because every cancer has a distinct set of these antigens on their surfaces, as do our normal cells, and therefore in some cases we can use them as an early warning system. Since they do appear in the blood, the bottom line is that if you're measuring this blood test and it's elevated, it doesn't mean you have cancer, or in this case colon cancer, but it may, and so you might want to start looking. But in addition, if you have colon cancer, it'd be definitely a way that you're followed up to see if it's recurring. If the levels start to rise, it may be that there's cancer recurring. One you're all familiar with is something called prostate-specific antigen, or PSA, that for prostate cancer, if this is elevated, you might have prostate cancer, and or if it's recurring, and so on. But you're probably also aware this is a very flawed blood test, and a lot of bad decisions have been made on it, and it drives home the point that we must use every test that we have available to investigate patients appropriately and with the best knowledge that we have. So let's just look at, again, prostate-specific the carcinoembryonic antigen, in this case cell membrane. Again, to orient you, this is the inside of the cell and the outside, and this is the protein called carcinoembryonic antigen. And so if you have colon cancer, they will measure this, and if it's rising again, it may indicate cancer returning. But what your doctors typically don't tell you, and definitely Cancer Care Ontario won't tell you, is 50% of you colon cancer patients who actually have recurrent and possibly never adequately treated from day one colon cancer, the CEA blood test is negative. What is that going to mean for you? Let's see. So again, patients diagnosed and treated, the levels are all normal. We're having the follow-up, and then in January 2017, the CE levels just start to creep up a little bit. But CT exams are normal, colonoscopy, everything's fine. So you keep getting the exams, and in this particular case, we're now around to November 2017, and they get their CT exam because the CEA levels keep going up, and the results: patients has the diagnostic CT from the base of their skull to their pelvis. It is negative. There is no evidence of recurrent colon cancer. But imagine if you're the patient, doctor, why does my blood levels of this keep going up? I mean, what does it mean? You've been on, Dr. Google on the internet, and you're obviously and should be worried, as you will see. So they're finally allowed that PET-CT, and this is the CT, or the PET, sorry, and you probably have guessed by now that these big black spots shouldn't be here. This is bad news. These are multiple cancers in the abdomen. They didn't start in February. They've been there for a very long time. They're very large, and in addition, we can also measure how much uptake is there. This is an aggressive cancer. The more blackness, it means the more sugar they're taking up, and these are aggressive lesions. But again, how could this be? The doctors are using Cancer Care Ontario's standards. I mean, how could this be? The CT is negative and yet the blood test is going up. What's your doctor going to tell you? I don't know, right? But in this case, we did get an answer because we got the FDG PET, right? So let's just look at that a little more carefully. This is, again, just a picture here. This is the left kidney. There's the liver and heart and so on. But let's look at this mass right here, right? So this is now, if you're familiar with that fused image we've taken, this is the sugar image. Again, it's a sugar, but in this case, we know it's active cancer cells. And this is a slice through, there's the kidney, and this is the liver and so on. And then we're seeing that. But now let's take the FDG part of that picture out and just look at the non-diagnostic CT that we acquired with that image. There is that mass right there. That, again, you think that wasn't there in, way back in November, but remember the report was negative, right? It definitely was there, as you will see. So in fact, every one of these lesions were missed on the diagnostic CT patients has had with the rising ZEA. We've looked at this one here, if you can tell, it's right on there's the patient's abdominal wall, some bowel contrast here, in the cecum actually, and there you can see it against the wall. This is a little small one in the middle of the mesentery. The mesentery, remember, is that apron in the abdomen, everything, the bowel hangs off. But let's look a little more carefully at this one up here. Let's go back to the PET CT and let's take away the FDG image and look at our another slice. This is a little different slice. It actually looks a little smaller because it is the way I've taken a different slice in this particular case. But this is our CT exam with the PET from February 2018. So let's go back and look at their diagnostic CT from way back in March 2017. You guessed it. That little tiny spot there becomes this much larger one there. And I can tell you that if this patient had had the FDG PET as they should have had, we'd have known long before March of 2017 if the patient had recurrent disease, and in fact may have been able to show the patient was never adequately treated day one. So the question is, does having an FDG PET scan, alter patient survival? Now remember, FDG PET is not a treatment, but in some cases it can lead to, it leads to doctors making the right decisions is what it does. And having access to this diagnostic tool can help doctors make early decisions that ultimately do end up, improving your survival. It's not like having the scan itself that improves your survival. It's the information, the critical information for your doctors. And a study was done, and what it did was they were looking at patients who had metastasis to their hepatic or liver, and the bottom line, don't worry about the fancy statistical term, remember this, that if you have proper access to FDG PET, if you look at your survival of these patients at 3 years, it's improved over not having this exam by 77%. In other words, almost 80% of patients who are followed appropriately with a PET scan are still alive at 3 years after stage 4 cancer. But when was this article written? 2001. That is 17 years ago, and I can assure you that the literature's only gotten better, and we only have better cameras and equipment since in the past 17 years, unless of course you live in Ontario. Remember, but it's 2018 in Ontario. 50% of colon cancer patients, of you patients out there with colon cancer, who actually have metastasis, you do not or do not qualify for a routine OHIP-funded PET CT scan in Ontario. And does this work? If you have colon cancer, you may have heard this man's name or seen it on the internet. Mr. Barry Stein, lawyer from Montreal, had stage 4 metastatic disease way back in 1995. Now we're going back 23 years, right, when this was available for patients if you happen to definitely not live in Ontario at that time. Today you don't have it available. But the bottom line was he sued the Quebec government, and that he did win, and that is, as described here in 1999, that serves as a leading precedent in Canada for reimbursement of out-of-country healthcare for patients across Canada. Maybe we could use it for out-of-province healthcare for patients in Ontario to actually go to Quebec and get the proper access. Or if you're going to be suing the government, this could be a very helpful case to look at. But in fact, that lawsuit led to a major change, and Quebec then started funding PET routinely, and now they're fully on board with it. But point is, I met Mr. Stein some 10 years after his stage 4 colon cancer, right? Remember the survival at 3 years, right? So what do you think? This patient's chances are living up to 10 years or more like Mr. Stein because they live in Ontario. And remember, in Ontario, colon cancer patients can only get an OHIP funded scan if their CEA was positive. Anyone want to guess what this patient's outlook would have been if their CEA was negative? You would have had that CT back in November, said, you know what, everything's fine, don't worry about it, right? I mean, it's probably a false positive or something else with a blood test. But except, of course, it wasn't, was it? Remember, 50% or more of colon cancer patients with recurrent disease, the CEA is negative, and you cannot get a routine PET scan. So let's just take a moment and think about what it would be like to be this patient, or if you already have colon cancer. I mean, you're in your mid-50s, you're looking forward to retirement, maybe already starting to retire, make plans. Blood in your stools, oh my God, what could this be? You're diagnosed with the C word, you've got colon cancer, and that your life of terror begins, and so on. But you know that you live in Ontario. It's the most populous and richest country, in Canada, or province, sorry, in the country of Canada. And of course, they got this massive organization called Cancer Care Ontario, who is going to definitely make sure that you have access to the most current and up-to-date ways of investigating and treating cancer, right? Okay, so you can imagine what it's like to be this patient now. They're now getting their blood tests, and now it's January, right? The blood test starts to go up, and you've been on Dr. Google, the internet, and you're starting to worry and waiting to the doctor's appointment. More blood tests are going to get, right? It's going up a little bit. You can see that, of course, by getting a blood test early, but you got to wait to the doctors to talk to them. They're scratching their head. They don't know. You get some more CT exams and so on. You don't get those on the internet, so you have to wait for that to see if it makes sense. You're now around in November 2017, and you're faced with a scenario, but it's definitely going higher, the CA. Not surprisingly why in this case, as you can see with all this disease, but the CT's negative. But how can this be? So you can imagine this patient waiting for their exams and so on and so forth. And as a patient put to me one time, so not terrifyingly well, she said, Dr. Webster, my life is on hold. I cannot sleep. I am consumed by this. And you can imagine who wouldn't be. And if you have colon cancer or any other cancer for that matter, you know what I'm talking about. But in fact, it doesn't have to be this way. We need to make a change. So I can assure you that this is intentional. Dr. Hoskins and the Liberals, and particularly for many years, they know this. If you think the physicians that are getting the answers from them don't know this, this is done to you with colon cancer patients intentionally. Who knows why? They're all very proud of it, though, remember. So this truly is yet another example of the Win Hoskins Liberal evidence-based patients first healthcare in Ontario. And yeah, you're right. This patient will die. They're not going to make 10 years. They'll be lucky to make another year or two, right? But they will die directly as a result of a liberal agenda directed squarely at this patient and the colon cancer patients of Ontario. My advice to you would be, if you have colon cancer in Ontario, you need to leave. Go next door to Quebec or someplace else to get proper access to the current, modern treatment and investigation of your cancers, and hopefully become part of what I hope is a Force 5 hurricane social media to force this is to be a major election issue and demand that Ontario's politicians finally explain just why they're all so proud of what is intentionally done to patients with cancer and lots of other diseases, as you will see in my blog series as we go along. So the next one in my series of Minister of Health, Minister of Disease is going to be an interesting one, lung cancer patients. And why is that important is because up to 90% of routinely funded PET scans in Ontario, the first ones to originally be funded, are to investigate if you've got a mass in your lung and a chest x-ray, or you actually have known cancer. I've said this before, but it's worth emphasizing. The indications for this OHIP funded scan are the exact opposite, let me repeat that, the exact opposite of the entire world expert body of opinion, and would lead Professor Rodney Hicks, the PET expert from Australia, to say in 2017, Ontario has the most egregious and politically motivated agenda against patients in the world. So, what is it going to mean for if you're being investigated for lung cancer or a possible lung cancer, if Dr. Hoskins has his sights set on you? We're going to see what the implications for those with lung cancer in Ontario will be. Let's make it happen. Thanks, and see you in the next video.